Before our story begins, let me welcome you, yes, you, listener wandering through this corner of imagination. You have arrived at a place between history and dream, a threshold lit by oil lamps and whispering leaves. Tonight, you and I will step beyond the daylight tales that scholars carve into tablets. Tonight, we walk into Babylon after the torches burn low, into a garden that blooms only in moonlit secrecy. Settle in. Listen to the hush of distant desert winds brushing stone. Feel the cool breath of water flowing through ancient channels. Look up, starlight gathers upon terraces hanging like sanctuaries in the sky. This is the place where myth breathes. And at the center of it all stands a single man, the gardener behind the wonder. While kings slept, he watered the wonders of the world. Let us begin. Azeru, that was his true name. Though in the palace it drifted like a half-forgotten rumor, few ever dared to speak aloud. Most knew him only by the designation etched into the royal labor tablets. Asterisk, the Night Keeper asterisk. A title without glory, without ceremony, and certainly without volunteers. It was a role assigned, not chosen, given to a man who preferred to vanish into the hours when others slept. Perhaps that was why the position had fitted him perfectly, like a mantle the darkness itself had tailored for him. I first saw him on an evening when the sun slid low over the western dunes, casting molten gold across the stone balustrades of Babylon. The courtyards beneath the hanging gardens shimmered with heat as the city groaned into twilight. Already the bustle of daytime scribes crossing chambers with clay tablets, diplomats arguing in shaded alcoves, royal wives drifting in procession with jeweled veils had begun to dissolve into the hush between sunset and nightfall. It was in this hour that Azeru emerged from the servants' gate with his quiet, almost soundless gait. He carried the same tools every night, a wide clay bucket, patched at the base where time had worn a crescent crack, a slender bronze hook used to coax stubborn vines into the direction they preferred not to grow, and a chipped clay cup, its rim uneven like a broken moon. This cup he guarded with a tenderness that surprised even me. Later, I learned it had belonged to his mother, the last relic of a woman who spoke to plants the way others prayed to gods. Azeru slipped between pillars like drifting smoke. He did not disturb the dust beneath his feet. The shadows swallowed him as if they knew him intimately, and in some strange way, they did. The hanging gardens by day were a spectacle, an empire's pride, a king's extravagant gesture to soothe the homesickness of his queen. The terraces overflowed with flowers from across continents, trees whose roots drank from ingenious aqueducts, vines that curled over frescoed walls. But despite its beauty, the place was crowded, noisy, and touched by too many hands. Every gesture, every pruning, every plucking was dictated by the needs of politics rather than the needs of the plants themselves. But at night, everything changed. The gardens shed their daytime posture like a performer stepping off stage. Under moonlight, petals stretched as if waking from shallow sleep, their surfaces catching faint silver glimmers. The vines that had hung limp and decorous in daylight tightened their coils, testing their own flexibility like young serpents. Leaves, dulled by the harsh Babylonian sun, gained a liquid radiance, each one dipped in dew that shimmered like polished jade. Even the earth beneath the stone platforms exhaled differently, releasing a cool breath that carried the scent of damp roots and ancient soil. Azeru belonged to this version of the garden, perhaps even more than the daylight caretakers who claimed expertise. He understood that plants had personalities, temperaments even. Some vines preferred to be touched gently, as if coaxed by affection. Certain ferns responded only to soft humming, and the great date palms, regal and aloof, bent their fronds only for those who approached with deep respect. Azeru moved among them not as a gardener, but as a familiar spirit. He knew which leaves bore secrets, which blossoms hid shyly, which trees had lived long enough to remember tales older than the city itself. There was something in his presence, something the palace servants whispered about when the heat of the kitchens made them bold. They said Azeru walked like a man who had long ago abandoned part of himself, left it somewhere in the roots of the garden. They said the plants recognized him, that they shifted when he approached. And most strange of all, they said he cast no shadow. This rumor reached me before I ever saw it with my own eyes. At first, I took it as one of those myth servants invent in boredom stories, meant to entertain children, or to explain the eerie hush that sometimes fell over the terraces at night. But when I followed him that first evening, keeping to the edges of the pathways so he would not notice me, I witnessed the truth. He climbed the terrace stairways, the moon slipping higher above him, pale and sharp as a blade. Silver light poured over the platforms in angled strokes, painting every column and leaf in luminous simplicity. Yet when the light should have cast a shadow behind him, there was almost nothing. A faint outline at best, lighter than smoke, so thin that the rustling leaves behind him swallowed it instantly. At first, I suspected a trick of the moon. Perhaps he walked in unusual angles. Perhaps the vines distorted the light. Yet each night I looked again, and each night the same uncanny phenomenon repeated itself. Azeru walked as though the darkness adored him, embraced him, absorbed every mark that should have declared his existence. He did not seem troubled by it. If anything, he appeared comforted by the way night enfolded him. The servants, however, spoke of it in uneasy tones. They said the plants drew his shadow away, eager to hold him close, eager to keep him for themselves. The notion was absurd. Plants did not claim people as companions. But Azeru always reacted to these whispers with a soft smile, as though he found the suggestion flattering rather than frightening. He did not deny it. Perhaps he could not. Azeru was not a man who sought attention. His silence was not a shield but a way of listening. He allowed the night to speak, and it was astonishing how much it told him. He knew when the water from the aqueducts ran thicker or thinner, when the channels clogged with wind-blown debris, when the lotus pond felt unbalanced, when the vines dreamed of rain. The garden's needs, its moods, its peculiarities, all of it reached him as if carried by invisible currents. I once watched him pause beside a row of papyrus reeds. He set his bucket down and touched one reed gently with the back of his fingers, like greeting an old friend. The reed, in turn, straightened, its thin stalk producing a faint, vibrating sound. Azeru leaned closer and listened. After a moment, he nodded. "Too many footsteps today," he murmured. "You dislike the noise." And with that, he quietly adjusted the flow of water feeding the papyrus bed, reducing it slightly. The reeds rustled in gentle approval. He never performed his tasks with haste. Instead, he moved through the terraces with a rhythm matched to the night, as if stepping in time with the slow rotation of stars. Patience was his craft. Understanding was his tool. And the chipped clay cup, his mother's, was something far more symbolic than functional. He used it not to measure water, but to remind himself of the woman who taught him the earliest language he ever learned, the language of growing things. She had been a herbalist from a small village near the foothills. When Azeru was still a boy, she carried him into the fields at dusk, pointing out which plants whispered warnings, which carried healing, which responded to human sorrow. She had died before he reached manhood, but her teachings clung to him like fragrance on the palms. The cup had been her favorite, chipped as it was, and he brought it to the gardens every night as if bringing her along to witness the wonder. Azeru's connection to the gardens was not born of duty, but of devotion. He loved the terraces the way one loves a companion, fiercely, protectively, and with a sense of reverence. The palace staff joked that Azeru was married to the vines, which he accepted without protest. In truth, the plants understood him more intimately than people ever had. Among humans, Azeru seemed misplaced, slightly out of rhythm with the world. But among the leaves and petals, he became himself. Night did not just conceal him, it completed him. There was always something in his posture as twilight deepened, something loosening, something unbinding, as though the weight of expectations and daylight scrutiny slid off him like sand through fingers. He breathed easier under moonlight. His steps grew lighter. His eyes, usually a sensibly muted brown, began to catch light like amber stirred by flame. I followed him one night onto the highest terrace, where the view opened into the vastness of Babylon, its ziggurats, its walls, its river winding like a dark ribbon. The wind from the Euphrates carried coolness upward. Azeru paused, not to admire the view, but to greet a cluster of night-blooming lilies. Their petals parted at his approach, as though stirred by a hidden tide. While others feared the darkness, Azeru welcomed it. While others hurried through shadows, he drifted into them with serenity. Night, to him, was not a time of concealment, but a realm where the world breathed in its truest form. And in that realm, he seemed carved from the same substance as moonlight and silence. People noticed, though few admitted it openly. Some feared him, some respected him, a handful pitied him. But Azeru himself cared for none of these things. He did not shape his life to suit rumors or gossip. His world was the quiet pulse beneath soil, the soft tremor of roots searching for water, the gentle sway of fronds responding to the night breeze. He had no family, no companions, no aspirations beyond tending the gardens. Even the role of night keeper he wore lightly, as if it was merely a name assigned to something deeper, something older. Long before I understood the language of the terraces, long before I learned the truth that would eventually surface, one question lingered every night as I watched him vanish into the shadowed maze of vines. Was Azeru a man who found refuge in the gardens, or had the gardens found refuge in him? And each night, as he ascended the terraces, moonlight washing over him and revealing nothing of his shadow, I felt the answer hovering at the edge of comprehension. He did not belong to the sunlit world. He belonged here, in the depths of night, where roots whispered, petals glowed, and ancient green things remembered him. Night made him different. Night made him whole. The hanging gardens, in the daylight stories repeated by scribes and poets, were spoken of as a marvel built by mortal hands, tier upon tier of stone, rising toward the sky, lush with imported greenery. Travelers called it the Eighth Wonder. Scholars called it the King's Triumph, and engineers admired its aqueducts and pulleys. But anyone who had ever stepped into the gardens at night knew the truth. The place was not simply built, it was conjured. It was shaped with the precision of a miracle, as though some ancient god had whispered blueprints into the king's ear and asked mortal men merely to follow instructions. Under the immense weight of stone and soil lay a system of water channels that seemed alive in their complexity. Some were carved deep into the foundation, older than Babylon itself, their stones marked with symbols eroded beyond interpretation. Others were newly forged from gleaming copper and bronze, spiraling in delicate loops like serpents sleeping beneath the terraces. All of these channels fed from a single source, the spiraling water engine powered by the Euphrates, its great wheels creaking and groaning as workers pushed against the slow resistance of the river. By day, the gardens were loud, noisy with the churn of machinery, the shouts of workers, the barked orders of overseers, ensuring the water reached its prescribed sectors. The water flow was vigorous, almost arrogant, rushing through the channels as if boasting that it alone sustained this man-made paradise. But when night fell, the wheels slowed. Human hands released their efforts. The water engine eased into a gentler rhythm, like a giant drifting toward slumber. Pressure shifted. Vibrations softened. The sound of the flow transformed into something subtle, almost intimate, as though the water had stopped following commands and begun searching for its own desire, its own path, its own destiny. Azeru understood these moods with a precision that unnerved those who observed him. He behaved as if he shared a secret language with the aqueducts and the channels, listening not with his ears but with something deeper and older inside him. Where others perceived only stone and metal, Azeru sensed breath and pulse. Where others saw water moving in narrow streams, he saw veins, circulation, life. I once followed him along one of the narrower passages that wound beneath the terraces. The air grew cooler there, damp and fragrant with mineral scent. Lichen clung in pale patches along the stone, shimmering faintly in the moon's filtered glow. Azeru walked ahead of me without a torch, letting his hands brush along the walls, as though each rough surface guided him. He ducked beneath a low archway, turned left at a fork so dark I could not see either path, and halted beside a thin copper pipe running along the ceiling. He placed his palm upon it with the kind of tenderness one reserves for a pulse on a wrist. A faint tremor moved through the metal, barely perceptible to me, but Azeru inhaled softly, as if receiving a whispered confession. The vibration held a pattern, a rhythm shaped by pressure and flow, telling of the water's journey through the gardens. "That tremor," he murmured once, though he rarely explained himself, "is how the gardens breathe." His words seemed ridiculous at first. How could stone platforms and foreign trees breathe? And yet, as he tilted his head and listened more closely, something in the air shifted. It was as if the sound beneath the surface held meaning, like the distant heartbeat of a giant creature resting beneath our feet. Azeru adjusted a small bronze valve with careful, measured turns. He moved slowly, not because he lacked skill, but because he respected the sensitivity of the mechanism. A fraction too much pressure could flood the southern terrace, drowning delicate roots. Too little, and the lotus pond would recede, exposing its sacred blossoms to drying air. Tonight, the water needed redirecting toward the northern terrace, where the star vines, the garden's most temperamental residents, were waiting. These vines were unlike anything known in Babylon. Their stems grew in twisting spirals, covered in pale blue blossoms that glowed faintly like captured moon fragments. Imported from a land forgotten by maps, they were alien, ethereal, and notoriously thirsty. They drank not merely water, but moonlit water, water cooled by night, fed through channels that resonated at a gentler frequency than the harsh daytime flow. Azeru knew the exact moment they began to thirst. He could feel it in the air, in the way their scent shifted from sweet to metallic, in the subtle dimming of their glow. Without him, they would wither, and the terrace would lose its quiet magic. When he opened the valve, the water redirected with a soft gurgling sigh. The copper pipe warmed slightly beneath his touch, then cooled as the water settled into its new path. Azeru closed his eyes, sensing the change rippling outward. He tracked the current in his mind, flowing up the spiral, through the secondary channels, around the bend where moss grew thick, and finally to the shallow clay basins feeding the star vines. He moved upward to the terrace to witness the effect for himself. The northern terrace was bathed in silver light. The star vines, draped over wooden frames and ancient brick, appeared dull and tired until the redirected water reached them. The moment the first drop entered their roots, something extraordinary happened. The blossoms brightened, their pale blue deepening into luminous azure. The vines seemed to lift themselves, ever so slightly, as though waking from exhaustion. Azeru exhaled with relief, though he had never doubted the effect. He walked among them, guiding errant tendrils with his bronze hook, untangling a few jealous vines that had coiled too tightly around their neighbors. The star vines responded instantly. Their blossoms pulsed with soft radiance, glowing brighter as he passed between them. He did not speak aloud, but he communicated nonetheless. His presence alone soothed them. His movements told them when to grow and when to rest. And the vines answered him not in words, of course, but in gestures of light, in the unfurling of petals, in the stilling of their restless spirals. I once asked him how he understood them so clearly. He only smiled faintly and touched the chipped cup at his belt. Some languages, he said quietly, are older than speech. He had learned from his mother long ago to perceive what others overlooked. The subtle shifts in rhythm beneath soil, the vibrations that traveled through roots, the chemical sighs emitted by leaves when they needed something. She had taught him that plants spoke in the way they grew, how they leaned, how they brightened or dimmed, how they contracted in fear or expanded in trust. Azeru's gift was not mystical in the way palace rumors painted him. It was, I realized, a kind of listening, an openness to signs that others dismissed as meaningless. But there was something else too, something unexplainable that even he did not speak of. A bond with the gardens that went beyond knowledge, a connection like gravity, inevitable and invisible. Only Azeru heard the responses of the garden fully. Others heard sounds, rustling leaves, flowing water. Azeru heard the intention, emotion, memory. As he knelt before the star vines now, the terrace illuminated softly by their glow, he closed his eyes again and allowed their presence to envelop him. The vines seemed to reach toward him, not physically, but energetically, expanding in his direction as if seeking his warmth. Their light flickered in synchronized pulses, reminiscent of breathing. He dipped his mother's clay cup into the basin and poured a thin stream of water over the roots of the oldest vine. The vine responded by brightening at its center, a ripple of light trailing down its length. "There you are," Azeru whispered, voice barely audible. "I know you've been waiting." This was the oldest star vine, the first to be planted in the northern terrace. It was precious, temperamental, and sometimes resentful of the younger vines that surrounded it. Azeru always visited it first, offering a gentle apology for the demands of the day. As the vine brightened, Azeru's face softened. In that glow, he looked less like a gardener and more like a priest tending an altar. Perhaps that is what he truly was, not a laborer, but a caretaker of something sacred and living, a guardian of a miracle that others saw only as architecture. When Azeru moved away, the vine dimmed hurriedly, as though reluctant to let him go. Each terrace had its own personality, but none loved him as fiercely as the northern terrace. The star vines, sensitive to energy and emotion, recognized his presence like a heartbeat. They responded to him with a devotion that could almost be mistaken for longing. Azeru lingered among them longer than he needed to. He often did, They comforted him in ways the human world never had. When he was among the vines, he did not need to hide his shadowless nature or explain his unusual habits. He was accepted without question, without suspicion. As he stood near the terrace edge overlooking the city bathed in moonlight, he rested one hand on the wooden trellis. The vines curled loosely around his fingers in greeting, brushing against him like delicate living ribbons. He smiled softly. "You're safe," he murmured. "I'm here." The garden responded with a wave of light, soft and synchronized, traveling from vine to vine like whispered agreement. Azeru's shoulders relaxed. He inhaled deeply, taking in the scent of damp blossoms and mineral-rich water. To others, the night felt silent, but to him, it thrummed with quiet music, the rhythm of flowing water, rustling leaves, and the shimmering breath of the star vines. He felt the garden's joy, their relief, their gratitude, and beneath it all, something older, something deeper, a presence within the stone and soil that stirred faintly whenever he touched the water channels. An ancient awareness that felt neither plant nor mortal. Azeru did not speak of that presence. Not yet. Perhaps he feared acknowledging it too soon. Perhaps he believed the gardens were not ready to reveal themselves entirely. But I saw the way he paused when the water tremor changed. I saw the way he touched the soil with reverence, as though expecting it to respond. I saw the way he leaned his ear toward the aqueduct walls, sensing something alive beneath them. Whatever the gardens hid, Azeru heard it. Whatever secrets the water carried, Azeru felt them. Whatever ancient memory slept beneath the terraces, Azeru stirred it gently, lovingly, unaware of how much the gardens depended on him. Or perhaps he was aware. Perhaps he had always known. Only Azeru heard their responses, and only he ever truly would. The story was always told the same way, repeated across marketplaces and taverns, carved into clay tablets by royal scribes who wished to immortalize their king in glory. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon had been built as a gift of love for Queen Ametis, a woman far from home who yearned for the cool mountains and verdant valleys of her distant homeland. According to that tale, King Nebuchadnezzar had raised the gardens as a promise that she would never again feel the ache of foreign soil beneath her feet. People adored that story. It softened the king's image, made his power feel almost tender. Travelers carried the tale across the desert, and by the time it reached distant lands, the king had become a symbol of devotion and the queen a figure of wistful longing. But Azeru knew the truth more intimately than any scribe, and the truth did not resemble the fable others repeated. The queen rarely visited. The first time Azeru had seen her enter the gardens, she arrived accompanied by half a dozen attendants holding parasols and fans. She walked the pathways without touching anything, gliding like a figure carved from alabaster. She admired a few flowers politely, commented on the fragrance of the myrrh blossoms, and then left, returning to her cool chambers where imported tapestries and scented oils attempted to mimic her homeland. She did not return for weeks, and when she did, it was only because foreign emissaries wished to witness the marvel created in her name. She smiled, nodded, murmured diplomatic praise, and departed again. No true longing shaped her steps. No grief softened her gaze when she looked upon the terraces. She was a queen, yes, but she was also a stranger to the garden that bore her name. And as for the king, Nebuchadnezzar's interest was fleeting at best. He visited during ceremonies or when dignitaries arrived, seeking spectacle. He admired engineering, not the life within it. He saw stone, structure, and scale, not breathing, not pulse, not the ancient threads woven beneath the earth. To him, the garden was proof of his power. To the queen, it was a diplomatic ornament. But to Azeru, it was something older, something alive. The ones who truly lived in the gardens were not rulers, nor servants, nor foreign guests. They were the plants themselves, the trees with roots stretching deep into channels older than Babylon, the vines that curled sleepily around carved columns, the flowers that open only when the moon coaxed them into shimmering tenderness. These were not mere decorations planted for royal amusement. They were ancient creatures, carrying memories in their sap, dreams in their petals, and secrets older than kingdoms in their silent depths. Sometimes Azeru wondered if people understood the magnitude of what grew here. Perhaps if they had listened, truly listened, they would have heard the soft whisper beneath the soil, the murmured conversation of leaves brushing against one another, the rhythmic hum in the roots whenever the water engine shifted. But people rarely listened to things that could not speak their language. Azeru did. He understood the gardens in a way that no one else did, in a way that no one else wanted to. Night after night, he moved through the terraces with the weight of a truth only he perceived. The gardens were not a gift of love. They were not an act of devotion. They were not built for a queen who hardly walked among them. They were here because the earth had chosen this place to dream. He stood now beside one of the oldest pomegranate trees, a towering structure whose branches sagged heavily under the jeweled burdens of ripened fruit. Each fruit glowed in the moonlight like a lantern full of garnet seeds. The bark was thick, cracked with age, and fragrant with sap that smelled faintly of honey and resin. Azeru placed his palm against the trunk, feeling the steady vibration within. "You are not here for a queen," he whispered, leaning close as if confiding in an old friend. "You are here because the earth wanted a place to dream." The tree's leaves rustled faintly, though no wind touched them. A shiver ran through the boughs, a tremor subtle enough that others might have dismissed it. But Azeru knew better. The tree was responding to him. Some said plants reacted to sunlight, water, or temperature. Azeru knew they also reacted to emotion. And the pomegranate tree, oldest of its terrace, seemed to carry centuries of quiet wisdom. It had lived before queens, before kings, before palaces were carved from stone. It knew why it was here. Azeru often wondered what stories it would tell if its leaves could form words. Perhaps it would speak of the land before the terraces existed, when the soil sat untouched beneath the desert sky. Perhaps it would speak of the first gardener who pressed a seed into earth and whispered a prayer over it. Or perhaps it would speak of deeper things, the pulse beneath the stone, the presence that Azeru always felt but never named. Tonight, as he leaned against the tree, something heavy settled in his chest. A weight he had carried for years, though he rarely acknowledged it. He was the only witness, the only one who saw the gardens as they truly were. A living being stitched together by water, stone, roots, and moonlit breath. The only one who sensed the quiet intelligence that pulsed beneath the terraces. The only one who understood that the gardens breathed differently at night, their rhythms shifting like a great creature dreaming beneath the surface of the earth. Most believed he tended the gardens as a simple duty, an assignment given to a quiet man who preferred solitude. They saw his nightly rituals as labor, not devotion. They saw his silence as dullness, not reverence. They saw the gardens as architecture, not life. But Azeru saw everything. He saw the sadness in the star vines when the water channels slowed. He saw the nervous quiver in the lotus leaves when storms approached. He saw the shy unfolding of blossoms who only dared to open when he was near. And he saw, most importantly, the faint, pulsing glow deep within the soil. A glow that flickered whenever he wandered too far from the terraces. as though the garden feared losing him. He sometimes felt guilty for knowing so much. The garden had chosen him, though he was never certain why. He was no priest, no scholar, no trained botanist. He had no lineage that tied him to sacred knowledge, and yet, the moment he first walked into the terraces, years ago, the leaves had turned toward him as if in recognition. Perhaps the garden had sensed something in him that others overlooked. A loneliness, a gentleness, a willingness to listen. Or perhaps the truth was simpler. Azeru belonged to the night, and so did the gardens. He could never shake the feeling that the two of them were woven together by some unseen thread. As he stood beneath the pomegranate tree now, he closed his eyes. The moon cast pale silver across his face, and the branches above him rustled softly, their weight shifting like someone adjusting their posture to embrace him more closely. He knew the trees did not move in the way animals did. No arms, no muscles, but their energy shifted around him, warming and tightening and relaxing in a way that felt unmistakably alive. Azeru felt that warmth reach into him, settle into his ribs, and stir something in his chest. It was affection, not the human kind, full of words and expectations. It was something simpler, older, like the earth acknowledging the one who tended its streams. And with that affection came the burden he carried without complaint. This place was not a royal gift. The terraces might have been commissioned by a king, shaped by the hands of architects and engineers, and adorned by the coins of the palace treasury, but none of that defined the gardens. What defined them was the ancient presence that pulsed beneath the soil, the intelligence that guided the vines, the memory woven into the roots of every tree. A gift can be admired from a distance, celebrated with pomp and ceremony. A burden must be held, carried, shouldered. Azeru carried the gardens every night. Not physically, the plants did not weigh him down, but the responsibility did. If he neglected even one terrace, the balance would shift. If he misjudged the needs of a single channel, a dozen plants might suffer. If he misunderstood the garden's whispers, something fragile might die. No one else felt the garden's pain. No one else feared its silence. No one else recognized when the night grew strangely still, when the water engine pulsed differently, when the roots quivered beneath the terraces like a creature stirred from sleep. Only Azeru, and he carried that knowledge alone. He traced the bark of the pomegranate tree with slow fingers, feeling the deep grooves etched by time. The fruit above him swayed slightly, casting shifting jewels of ruby light across his face. "I'll keep you safe," he whispered, "even if no one else sees you for what you are." The tree's leaves shimmered in response, catching the moonlight like tiny mirrors. Azeru stepped back and took in the view of the terraces, the layers of greenery rising toward the sky, the vines cascading in slow drapes over stone, the faint glow of the star vines on a distant veranda, the lotus pond reflecting scattered shards of moonlight. It was breathtaking. It always was. But tonight, the beauty carried a sharper edge, tinged with the sobering reality of his solitude. He alone understood the gardens. He alone protected them. He alone heard their voice. Sometimes, in the quietest hours of the night, he wondered whether this responsibility was a blessing or a curse, whether he had been chosen or trapped, whether the gardens loved him or clung to him out of necessity. But no matter the truth, he returned every night. He could not do otherwise. His heart, like the gardens, pulsed on a rhythm that belonged to the moon and the whisper of water in the channels. He breathed deeply, inhaling the mingled scents of pomegranate, starvine blossoms, damp earth, and the faint mineral hint of the aqueducts. These fragrances, these sounds, These textures, they were his world, a world he carried alone. Yet, as he walked deeper into the terraces, the vines shifted gently toward him, and the leaves trembled softly in greeting. The soil beneath his feet seemed to sigh, as though grateful for his presence. This burden was heavy, but it was also beautiful, and every night, Azeru chose to carry it again. Azeru had grown accustomed to solitude so thoroughly that even the slightest intrusion into his nights felt like a disruption of the garden's natural order. The plants breathed with him, pulsed with him, shared their nocturnal rhythms with his own heartbeat. Nights were his sanctuary, the one realm untouched by the court's noise or the judging eyes of servants, and he had believed naively, perhaps, that he was the only soul in Babylon who dared walk the terraces after dusk. That was why, on a particularly clear night, when the moon hung low and round like a silver lantern, he froze at the faintest hint of a voice. "You speak to them, I've heard you." The words floated across the eastern terrace with a softness that did not belong to the usual intruders. No guard, no servant, no late roaming noble. They were spoken almost gently, as though the speaker feared to disturb the slumbering leaves. Azeru stiffened. His hand tightened around the bronze hook at his side. Very few came here after dusk, and those who did usually carried torches and loud intentions. But this voice carried neither. He turned slowly, wary and silent, and saw her. A young woman stood between the moonlit columns, her silhouette framed by the glowing star vines that draped over the stone like pale blue waterfalls. She wore a simple linen dress, unadorned and practical, the fabric faintly dusted with the chalk residue of her trade. Her hair, dark as the river at midnight, was braided with dried sprigs of herbs, lavender, rosemary, and a few he did not immediately recognize. Their brittle shapes crackled softly each time she shifted. Under her arm she held a clay tablet and stylus, identifying her instantly as an apprentice scribe. She should not have been here. Scribes worked by daylight, copying records, translating decrees, tallying supplies. They did not roam gardens at night, especially not terraces where the plant's nocturnal transformation was most pronounced. Yet she stood boldly among the vines, moonlight gilding her profile. Her name, he would learn soon enough, was Laleh. He did not know then that this stranger, slight and unassuming, would become the single thread capable of unraveling the quiet tapestry of his life. He did not know she would watch him with eyes that saw too much, that her presence would become a shift in the garden's breath, a change he had never invited yet could not stop acknowledging. But at that moment, she was simply an intruder in a world that had never allowed one. Azeru's voice emerged low and guarded. "I speak to no one." Her head tilted, the moon caught in her eyes, revealing their clever brightness. "You lie poorly." He almost flinched, not because her tone was sharp, but because her certainty was. She stepped closer, moving with the kind of measured curiosity one might show toward a rare artifact, careful, respectful, but without fear. The vines parted slightly around her, brushing the linen of her dress in light passes, as though greeting her with polite interest. Azeru noticed this with a tightening in his chest. "People who notice such things usually meant trouble," she continued. "The plants lean when you pass, not toward the moon, toward you." Azeru looked away. He didn't want her to see his expression surprise first, then irritation, then something more unsteady, something he could not easily name. Very few people ever noticed how the garden reacted to him. Fewer still dared say it aloud. There was danger in being observed too closely. People who understood what he was might begin to fear what he could be. He forced his tone into something solid, cold. "It is imagination. Go back to your quarters." But she did not move. Instead, she walked toward the vines with a kind of fearless innocence. She extended her fingers toward a cluster of moon orchids. Azeru tensed, ready to intervene. The moon orchids did not always take kindly to human touch, but to his confusion, they opened wider at her approach, revealing their pale, shimmering throat. Laleh inhaled slowly. "They're beautiful." "You shouldn't be here," Azeru said again, softer this time. "The garden at night is not the same as what you see in daylight." End quote. "Exactly," she murmured. "That's why I wanted to see it." He almost cursed under his breath. Curiosity was the most dangerous thing a person could bring into these terraces. Curiosity led to questions. Questions led to discoveries. Discoveries could lead to ruin. She turned back to him, her hair catching strands of silver light. "Teach me." Azeru blinked. "Teach you what?" "Their language," she said simply. "Teach me how to listen." Her earnestness struck him unexpectedly hard. She spoke with no hesitation, no self-consciousness, no understanding of what she was asking for. The garden's language was not something one could teach like handwriting or mathematics. It was felt, breathed, understood through years of immersion, and even then, only some people heard its whispers. He shook his head. "No." "Why not?" she asked, stepping closer to him. "Because it is not for you." She narrowed her eyes. "How would you know what is for me?" He opened his mouth, then closed it again. She had a point, one he was not ready to acknowledge. A long silence stretched between them, filled only by the rustle of leaves and the quiet pulse of the aqueduct beneath the terrace. Azeru felt the garden reacting to this new presence. The vines trembled softly with interest. Even the water beneath the stones seemed to shift direction subtly, as if listening. He felt a faint tremor at his back. The pomegranate tree on the upper terrace. It had awakened, sensing the intruder. The gardens rarely welcomed strangers. Azeru prepared for the subtle shivers of disapproval, the tightening of vines, the closing of petals. But nothing tightened, nothing recoiled. The gardens were watching her. That realization unsettled him more than her presence itself. If the gardens accepted her, even tentatively, it meant she possessed something he could not yet identify, something he could not ignore. Laleh noticed his hesitation and stepped closer still. "I hear something," she whispered. Azeru stared at her sharply. "What?" "Not words," she said. "Just a feeling, as though the leaves are restless, as though they shift toward us." His pulse quickened. This was worse than he feared. An ordinary intruder could be turned away. But someone who sensed the garden's presence, no matter how faintly, was something altogether different. He kept his voice even. "You are imagining it." "No," she said firmly. "I'm not." Azeru's breath tightened. The garden hummed faintly beneath his feet, a vibration so subtle only he should have recognized it. But Laleh's expression changed, her gaze focusing downward. "You feel it too," she said. Azeru's mask cracked. Only slightly, but enough that she saw it. She smiled, not triumphantly, but with quiet wonder. "I knew it. You know nothing." Azeru snapped, more harshly than he intended. She did not flinch. "Then teach me something." He hated that her voice hit him like that, earnest, unpolished, stubbornly gentle. She wasn't demanding. She wasn't arrogant. She wasn't careless. She wanted to understand. And she asked with the kind of sincerity that made him feel slightly off balance. "I can't teach you," he said. "You won't teach me," she corrected. He exhaled sharply through his nose. "It is dangerous." So is living, she said with a shrug. Her casual tone nearly made him choke. This girl, this apprentice who smelled faintly of parchment and crushed herbs, was standing in the heart of the most alive place in Babylon, under vines that responded to breath and intention, beside roots older than any kingdom. And she shrugged. Azeru had always been cautious, methodical. But Laleh moved as though she trusted the unknown, as though she found beauty in unpredictability. That frightened him more than he cared to admit. The moon shifted, casting a brighter beam across the terrace. In that moment, Laleh stepped toward the star vines. Their blossoms reached toward her, tiny filaments glowing brighter, reacting to her nearness in a way Azeru had never seen them respond to a stranger. His heart lurched. He strode forward, grabbing her wrist gently but urgently. "Don't." She looked up at him with calm, steady eyes. "They aren't afraid." "No," he said quietly. "They're curious. And that's bad? Curiosity leads to attention," he murmured. "And attention leads to change." "What kind of change?" she asked. He hesitated. The truth was not something he could easily articulate. The gardens changed those who walked them, shaped the souls who listened. He had felt it over the years, his own identity softened by the whisper of leaves, his emotions intertwined with the rhythms of the aqueduct. The gardens did not merely exist, they influenced. He finally said, "The kind you can't walk away from." She studied him for a long moment. "Maybe I don't want to walk away." Azeru released her wrist. The warmth of her skin lingered on his fingertips far longer than he liked. He needed to turn her away. For her safety, for his sanity, for the garden's stability. But the words would not form. They tangled in his throat. She stepped back toward the vines, letting their tendrils brush her sleeve. Her gaze softened, her expression open and sincere. "This place, it feels alive," she whispered, "like it's breathing." "It is," Azeru said before he could stop himself. Her eyes widened. He cursed silently. In one careless moment, he had revealed too much. Then she said softly, "I knew it." And to quote, that was when something in Azeru, some long-sealed place inside him, shifted. Not opened, not welcomed, but tilted, as if reconsidering the possibility of letting someone else step into his private world. Her presence hadn't broken the night. It had merely changed it. A seed planted where no one should plant seeds. And Azeru, who had never allowed another human to witness his solitude, realized the most dangerous truth of all. He did not want her to leave. For weeks, the nights had been predictable, quiet, rhythmic, shaped by the soft pulse of water and the whisper of leaves. Azeru had learned the garden's moods so completely that he could sense even the smallest shift in pressure, the faintest ripple in the roots. But on this night, with Laleh standing beside him beneath the moonlit arch of the eastern terrace, something in the air felt altered. It began subtly, like a breath the earth had forgotten to release, a stillness, a pause, an intake. Then the trembling came. It was not violent, no crack of stone, no sudden jolt. Instead, it was a low, rolling tremor that moved beneath the terraces like a ripple across the surface of a massive creature sleeping beneath the ground. Laleh reacted instantly, startled, instinct pulling her toward the nearest column. Her hands gripped the carved stone tightly, knuckles whitening. "What was that?" she whispered, her voice thin with alarm. Azeru felt a matching tremor, not in the stone, but within himself. He had felt the garden stir before, but never like this. Never in response to another person's presence. He forced his voice into something steady, though certainty eluded him. The deep aquifers shifting, he said, offering the explanation he had given palace workers countless times. But he knew, and the gardens knew he knew. It was more than aquifers. Much more. The air changed first. The cool night breeze stilled, as if holding its breath. The hanging leaves overhead stopped rustling, suspended in unnatural silence. The familiar hum of flowing water, normally a gentle undercurrent of the garden's heartbeat, softened into something tighter, tenser, as though the channels were straining to hear something. Then the star vines reacted. They tightened inward, drawing their pale blue blossoms close to their stems, like startled creatures curling into themselves. The glow within their petals dimmed, flickering like uncertain candlelight. Azeru had seen the vines respond to shifts in weather, to dryness, to new pruning, but never to a human. The plum trees followed, their branches lifted faintly, as though bracing, and released bursts of sharp fragrance and ancestral defense, their way of warning the garden that something unexpected had entered. Even the air thickened. It pressed lightly against the skin, warm and vibrating, like the breath of an unseen presence. Laleh sensed it too. Her eyes darted across the terrace, searching for the source of the feeling she could not name. "Azeru?" she whispered. "Why does it feel different now?" He said nothing at first. He walked past her slowly, his feet silent against the stone. Then, without warning, he knelt, pressing a palm against the soil between the roots of a lotus-bearing shrub. He leaned closer still, lowering his ear until it touched the cool ground. Laleh watched him with widening eyes, torn between fear and fascination. Azeru's breath slowed. His brow tightened as he listened. Beneath the soil's surface, beneath the stone foundations and water channels, beneath the rootwork tangled through the terraces, he heard it. A rhythmic hum, soft, low, almost hypnotic, like the turning of a submerged wheel, like something awakening. It was not the aquifers. It was the gardens. "They're listening," he murmured. Laleh froze. "They?" Azeru lifted his head. His expression was distant, strained, as though he was speaking to someone neither of them could see. He rose slowly to his feet, brushing soil from his fingertips. "Promise me something," he said softly. His voice held a gravity she had not heard before, an urgency sharper than the tremor beneath their feet. "What you see tonight," he continued, "you must speak of to no one." Laleh blinked. "Why? What would they—" "Promise me," Azeru insisted. She hesitated, her face lit faintly by the soft glow of the moon. Her curiosity was unmistakable, the kind that had drawn her into the garden in the first place. The kind that made her follow him through terraces that should have been forbidden to her. The kind that could, in the wrong circumstances, undo everything Azeru had spent years keeping quiet. But even curiosity could not outweigh the trust budding between them. "I promise," she said, but the dangerous gleam in her eyes told him the truth. A promise would not stop her from seeking answers. Not if she believed the garden was speaking, and the garden was speaking. Azeru felt it in every bone. The hum beneath the earth deepened, tinged with something unfamiliar. The roots were shifting, not physically, but energetically, as though they were turning their attention toward him, toward her, toward the presence of something new. He exhaled slowly. "You should not have come here tonight." Laleh's voice softened. "Because of this?" "No," Azeru said. "Because the garden has not felt another human walking its night paths for many years. It doesn't know what to make of you." The star vines trembled faintly. Their glow brightened and dimmed in a stuttering rhythm, mirroring the pulse in Azeru's throat. Laleh stepped cautiously toward him. Is it angry? No, Azeru whispered. Not angry. Not yet. And the ground trembled again, slightly stronger this time, a ripple sweeping across the terrace. Laleh breathed in sharply and grabbed his arm for balance. Azeru steadied her, then steadied himself. He could feel the tremor's source more clearly now. The water channels beneath the terrace were shifting their flow, not through force, not through pressure, through intention. That was what disturbed him most. The garden wasn't reacting to the tremor was reacting to Laleh. Azeru, she murmured, voice barely audible. Is this because of me? He didn't answer. The truth hung between them, like a low, heavy cloud. She stepped back, suddenly unsure of her place. I didn't mean to disturb anything. You didn't disturb it, Azeru said carefully. You awakened something. What? He looked at her, at the young woman who had walked boldly into a world she did not understand, whose curiosity had seeped into the garden like water into parched soil. Something very old, he said. Something that doesn't wake lightly. She swallowed hard. Should we leave? No, his voice softened. The garden is listening. We have to let it. Laleh glanced around, her gaze darting to the vines, the trees, the shimmering petals trembling with cold starlight. She shivered not from temperature, but from the uncanny sensation that the entire terrace was watching her. Azeru sensed that fear. It doesn't want to harm you, he said gently. The garden does not lash out without reason. But it could, she whispered. He hesitated. Yes. The soil beneath them pulsed again. Azeru closed his eyes and placed one hand flat against the stone. He breathed deeply, slow and steady, matching the garden's rhythm. The tremor gradually softened beneath his touch. The air eased, but only slightly. It's reacting to emotions, Azeru murmured, mostly to himself. Whose emotions? She asked. Yours, he said after a moment. And mine, and its own. She stared at him in disbelief. Plants have emotions? The garden does, he corrected. The roots, the water, the stone. There is something woven through all of it, something awake. Laleh took a slow step toward him, either out of trust or because she feared to move anywhere else. You hear it. You always hear it. He did not deny it. Her voice grew soft. Is this why you never let anyone come here at night? Yes, he whispered. The night deepened around them. The moonlight flickered across the terraces, as though moving water was reflecting it, even though the surface of the lotus pond lay still. The air felt charged alive with watchfulness. Laleh's breath trembled. Azeru, what is it listening for? He turned to her slowly, and she saw something in his face she had never seen there before. Not fear, not dread, but a heavy, resigned understanding. It wants to know, he said, whether you belong here. She froze. Do I? I don't know yet. Habrat. Another tremor passed, softer, almost like a sigh. Azeru reached out, surprising himself, and gently took her hand. He guided her toward the center of the terrace, where the roots grew thick beneath the stone. Stand here, he said. Be still. Laleh obeyed. Though her hand trembled in his, Azeru lowered both palms to the ground. Silence fell deep, vast, complete, and in that silence, Azeru felt it. The garden leaning closer, the roots pressing upward, the water shifting, the vines trembling, the air thickening. It was as if every leaf in the terraces had turned toward this single point, toward Laleh. She stood quietly, uncertain, breath shallow. Then something subtle changed. Not a tremor, not a pulse, a recognition. Azeru opened his eyes. "It accepts you," he whispered. Laleh stared at him. "Just like that?" "No," he said softly. "Not just like that. It has been watching you since the moment you stepped into its shadow." She swallowed. "So, what happens now?" Azeru's gaze lingered on her, and for the first time he looked at her not as an intruder or a danger, but as part of the garden's unfolding story. "Now," he said quietly, "it will want to know more." "And you?" Azeru hesitated. The garden's hum still thrummed beneath his touch. "I will have to keep you close," he said, "whether I want to or not." Laleh's breath caught just slightly, and deep beneath the stone, the ancient hum grew warmer, as if pleased. The night had settled in deep silence, with only the rustle of leaves and the faint hum of distant wheels turning, bringing water from the Euphrates. The hanging gardens, in their magnificence, lay still and calm under the pale moonlight. The soft glow of the star vines twinkled like constellations caught in mid-bloom, and the air, cool and thick with the scent of damp earth, held the weight of secrets older than the city itself. Azeru walked through the gardens with his usual quiet grace, his footsteps almost soundless against the stone paths. His heart beat in rhythm with the garden's pulse, as if he and the plants were one, their movement synchronized with the ebb and flow of the earth itself. His eyes were fixed ahead, but his mind, as always, was somewhere deeper, somewhere beneath the surface of the gardens, where the roots of life wound their way through the earth, carrying mysteries that even he was not entirely sure of. As he approached the central terrace, the humming grew louder, a deep, vibrating pulse that seemed to come from the earth itself. The trees, heavy with fruit, seemed to shudder in response to it, their branches bending as if listening. It was then that Laleh caught up with him, her footsteps hesitant but determined. She had been following him for weeks now, learning from him in silence, observing, questioning, and, most disturbingly, understanding. Something about her quiet presence disturbed him. She asked too many questions, saw too much, and her curiosity, unlike that of the other servants or emissaries, had begun to stir the dormant energy of the gardens. "The Well of Kishar," Azeru murmured as they reached the highest terrace, his voice low, almost reverent. "Named after the goddess of horizons. They say the first gardeners poured blessings into this well, offerings of water and words to the gods of the earth." Laleh stepped closer, her dark eyes wide with interest. She was a scribe's apprentice, young and eager, her heart full of the unspoken desire to uncover the mysteries hidden within the ancient stone walls of the royal gardens. Despite the late hour, there was no hesitation in her movements, no fear of the darkness that enveloped the gardens after the sun set. She was drawn to the night in a way that reminded him of himself when he was young, when he first walked the paths of the gardens, learning to listen to the whispers of the vines and the murmur of the earth beneath his feet. "But you don't believe that?" Laleh asked, her voice soft but sharp with the edge of suspicion. She glanced at him, trying to read his expression. Azeru did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached out and ran his fingers along the ancient stone rim of the well, his touch gentle as if afraid of disturbing something fragile. The carvings on the stone were faded with time, but still, they seemed to pulse with a forgotten energy, an energy that Azeru had felt since the first night he had walked these gardens. He had learned long ago that belief was a human construct, a way to explain what could not be understood. But belief, as he had discovered, did not matter here. The truth of the gardens was older than belief. "Belief does not matter," he said, his voice low and grave. What sleeps beneath does. Laleh stared at him, her brow furrowed in confusion, but she did not press him further. There was something in his tone that made her pause, something in the way his words seemed to carry the weight of ages, of knowledge too ancient for her to comprehend. The wind shifted then, a soft, whispering breeze that stirred the leaves and made the vines tremble. It was a breeze that spoke of secrets, of things buried beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. And then, as if in answer to the wind's call, a faint light began to rise from the depths of the well, pale green and flickering, like the glow of fireflies trapped in water. It was ethereal, otherworldly, and for a moment, the air seemed to thicken with the weight of the mystery it held. Laleh gasped, her breath catching in her throat as she watched the light swirl and dance in the water below. It was unlike anything she had ever seen, a glow that seemed to come from the very heart of the earth. She stepped forward, her eyes fixed on the mesmerizing sight. "What is that?" she whispered, her voice barely a breath. Azeru stood still, his gaze fixed on the glowing light as it pulsed and shifted beneath the surface of the water. He knew what it was, knew the power it contained, but he had never spoken of it to anyone. Not even the king knew the full truth of the gardens, of the forces that slumbered beneath their roots. The gardens were more than a gift for a queen. They were a living, breathing entity, an ancient force that held the secrets of the earth itself. "It is something the king will never know," Azeru whispered, his voice low and filled with a kind of reverence, "and something you must never repeat." Laleh turned to him, her eyes wide with a mix of awe and fear. "What do you mean? What is it? What lies beneath?" Azeru looked at her then, his expression grave, and for the first time, Laleh saw the weight of his burden, the knowledge he carried, the responsibility that had been passed down to him from the very first gardeners. The gardens were not just a place of beauty, they were a place of power, a power that could not be fully understood or controlled. And it was his job, his burden, to tend to them, to protect their secrets, and ensure that they did not fall into the wrong hands. "You must promise me something, Laleh," he said, his voice steady but urgent. "What you see tonight, you will speak of to no one. Not to your fellow scribes, not to the king, not to anyone. Do you understand?" Laleh nodded, though the words she wanted to speak were caught in her throat. She did not fully understand what she had just seen, but she understood the gravity of Azeru's request. There was something dangerous here, something that could destroy everything if it was revealed to the wrong people. And yet, even as she promised him, a part of her, curious, daring, and full of wonder, wanted to know more. She wanted to uncover the truth behind the gardens, behind Azeru's cryptic words, and the mysterious power that seemed to pulse from the well beneath their feet. But for now, she said nothing. She merely nodded. And in that quiet moment, Azeru felt a flicker of something that he hadn't felt in years. A sense of connection, of understanding, of shared purpose. It was fleeting, but it was there. As the night deepened and the light from the well faded back into the darkness, the two of them stood in silence. Azeru knew that the gardens were changing, that something ancient and powerful was stirring beneath the surface, and he feared what that might mean. For the first time in his life, he wondered if the gardens, in all their beauty and power, were something that could not be controlled. And with that thought, the weight of his responsibility settled more heavily upon his shoulders. He had always known the gardens were more than what they seemed. But now, with Laleh's presence here, with her curiosity and her questions, he realized that the time had come. The gardens were awakening. and whether they were ready or not, the world would soon know their true power. The night had deepened, and the air grew cooler as the moon climbed higher into the sky, casting its silver light over the hanging gardens. The gentle rustle of leaves was the only sound that filled the silence between Azeru and Laleh. They stood together, side by side, facing the well of Kashar, its waters now rippling with an ethereal mist that shimmered like moonlight on water. The glow was faint but mesmerizing, swirling in delicate spirals, beckoning them to come closer, to touch it, to understand it. Laleh's gaze was fixed on the mist, her breath caught in her throat. There was something almost magnetic about it, something ancient and alluring. She had never seen anything like it before, and for a moment she forgot everything else, the kingdom, the palace, even her own questions. The only thing that mattered was the mist, the glow that seemed to pulse with life. Instinctively, she took a step forward, her hand reaching out toward the swirling mist. It was as though the mist itself was calling to her, promising answers, secrets hidden beneath its surface. But before her fingers could touch it, Azeru's hand shot out, grasping her wrist with surprising strength. "No," he said, his voice urgent. "It marks those who touch it." Laleh froze, her heart skipping a beat. She turned to him, her expression one of confusion and curiosity. "What do you mean? Why would it mark me?" Azeru's eyes were closed, his face tense, as if listening to something far beyond the realm of what Laleh could comprehend. He did not answer her immediately. Instead, he stood there, his posture rigid, as though he were waiting for something. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, he spoke, his voice quieter, almost reverent. "It marks those who touch it because it's not just a well. It's a doorway, a passage between worlds. And it does not give its secrets easily." He looked at her, his gaze intense, as if weighing his next words carefully. "It speaks a language beneath language, something that predates us all. We call it root speak. And Laleh's breath caught in her throat. She had heard whispers about the mysterious language of the gardens, of the strange connection that Azeru seemed to have with the plants and the earth. But to hear it spoken aloud, to hear it named so plainly, was something else entirely. "Root speak?" she repeated softly, her voice trembling. "But how? How can you understand it?" Azeru's lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment he did not answer. Instead, he turned his attention back to the mist, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if he were listening to something far beyond their immediate surroundings. The air around them felt thick, charged with an unseen energy that seemed to hum in the very soil beneath their feet. "I understand it," he said slowly, "but only a little. It's not something that can be fully grasped, not even by me." Laleh felt a shiver run down her spine as she absorbed his words. She had known there was something extraordinary about Azeru, something otherworldly that set him apart from the others who tended the gardens, but this was something else entirely. Root speak, a language older than the city of Babylon itself, a language of the earth, of the roots that wound their way beneath the gardens, beneath the stones, and into the very heart of the world. It was a language that did not belong to humans, a language that spoke directly to the heart of the earth itself. Laleh looked at him, her mind racing. "What is it saying now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Azeru stood still, his expression focused, as though he were listening to something distant, something beyond the physical world. His eyes closed again, and for a moment he was lost in the world of the garden's voice, his senses attuned to the vibrations in the air, to the pulse of the mist, to the hum of the earth beneath them. "It says," he began slowly, his voice filled with quiet awe, "it says that something has changed. Something new has entered its world." Laleh's heart skipped a beat. "What does that mean?" she asked, her voice thick with uncertainty. Azeru did not immediately answer. Instead, he continued to listen, his brow furrowing as the mist swirled in front of them. The air around them seemed to thicken, and for a moment it felt as though time itself had slowed, as if the entire world were holding its breath. Laleh's pulse quickened. "What's it saying now? What has changed?" Azeru turned to face her, his expression unreadable. His eyes met hers, and in that moment, Laleh understood. There was no need for words. She had already guessed, already felt it, felt the change that had been brought about by her presence here, by the simple act of stepping into this world that Azeru had guarded for so long. She had become part of it, unknowingly, unwittingly. The garden had recognized her, just as it had recognized Azeru before her. "It's you," Azeru said quietly, his voice almost a whisper. "It's you. You are the change." Laleh stared at him, her mind racing to understand what he meant. Her breath caught in her throat as the weight of his words settled over her like a cloak, heavy and suffocating. "But how?" she asked, her voice trembling with disbelief. "How can I be the change? I'm just a scribe's apprentice." Azeru looked at her with a mixture of sadness and wonder, as though he were seeing her for the first time. "The garden has its ways," he said softly, "ways that even I do not fully understand. But it has chosen you, Laleh. You are not just an observer anymore. You are part of it." She shook her head, trying to make sense of his words. It felt impossible, unreal. How could she, a mere girl from the royal scribe's quarters, be chosen by the garden? What had she done to deserve such a fate? "I don't understand," she whispered. Azeru's gaze softened, and for a moment he looked almost regretful. "You don't have to understand it all, Laleh," he said quietly. "Not yet. The garden has been waiting for you, for someone like you, for longer than you can imagine. It's waiting for all of us, and it will change us in ways we cannot yet see." Laleh's heart beat faster as his words echoed in her mind. Something was happening, something vast and ancient, and she had become a part of it, whether she was ready or not. The mist before them swirled and shifted, its light pulsing softly. The garden's voice, root-speak, whispered in the air, a language beyond comprehension, but one that she felt deep in her soul. It had chosen her, and at that moment, Laleh understood. There was no turning back. The night stretched on, each one a tapestry of silence broken only by the sounds of distant water wheels turning, the rustle of vines shifting under the cool breath of the wind. The moon, steady in its climb across the sky, cast pale beams through the gardens, illuminating the path that Azeru walked every night. He had grown accustomed to the quiet, to the solitude that wrapped around him like the vines he tended to so carefully. It was the silence of the garden, and it was his, a secret world where only he and the plants existed in harmony. But now, things were changing, and with them, the uneasy stillness of the nights began to shift. Laleh had become a part of this world, following him with an intensity that both unnerved and fascinated him. She had asked for nothing but to learn, and her curiosity had driven her to ask questions, to listen, to watch, and most of all, to understand. There were nights when she said nothing at all, her eyes fixed on the movements of the plants, her fingers tracing the patterns in the leaves. And then there were nights like this, When she would speak, quietly, but with a clarity that seemed to reach into the very heart of the gardens. Azeru had never intended for anyone to walk beside him in the gardens at night, certainly not someone like Laleh, but she had followed him nonetheless, persistent and eager. And despite the reservations that churned in his chest, he had found himself teaching her how to read the subtle language of the plants, the way the leaves tilted when they thirsted, the way vines whispered with a sigh when they were watered, the way flowers seemed to mourn the absence of light. She learned quickly, with a hunger that matched his own when he was young. But with each lesson, with each piece of knowledge he shared, something inside Azeru twisted. It was not the knowledge that worried him, no. It was something darker, something deeper. Root speak, the language of the earth that only he could hear, had grown more restless. The subtle hum beneath the surface, the pulse of the gardens that he had come to know as well as his own heartbeat, had begun to change. The water channels vibrated unpredictably at night, their flow erratic and disjointed. The plants, too, had started to act strangely. The vines would tremble without the stir of wind, the flowers would close before their time, and the air itself seemed to thicken with tension. He had never felt the garden so alive, so aware. It was as if the earth itself was holding its breath, waiting for something, or someone, and that someone, he knew, was Laleh. That night, they worked together beneath the soft glow of the lantern lily, pruning its long tendrils with careful precision. The flowers were delicate, their petals as soft as silk, their scent faint but sweet, like a secret. Azeru moved with practiced ease, his knife sharp, his hands steady. Laleh, however, worked more slowly, still learning the rhythm of the plants, still finding her way in the quiet world of the garden. She had asked questions since the very first night, and though Azeru had tried to avoid most of them, tonight something felt different. The air was thick with a strange, pulsing energy that had become a constant presence in the gardens. The mist from the well had risen again, swirling in the distance like a slow-moving fog. The star vines glowed faintly, their pale blue light dimming and brightening in strange intervals, as if responding to something beyond their reach. Laleh paused in her work, her eyes soft, almost distant. She had become more attuned to the plants in the last few nights, her senses sharpened, her understanding of the gardens deepening. Yet, even with all she had learned, there was something she still could not grasp, something she sensed but could not name. "Why do you do this alone?" she asked softly, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Azeru froze, his knife halting mid-air. The question was simple, but it felt heavy, as though she had peeled back a layer of the world he had so carefully constructed. He did not answer immediately, but instead took a deep breath, as if gathering the fragments of something he had long buried inside himself. The question lingered in the air between them, pressing in on him, until finally he lowered his knife and sheathed it. His eyes flickered to the ground, his gaze distant as he spoke, his voice low, as though revealing a secret he had never told anyone. "Because no one else hears what I hear," he said. His words were quiet, but they carried the weight of years, years of solitude, of tending to a garden that thrived on silence and secrets, of a life lived in the shadows of others' expectations. Laleh looked at him, her brow furrowing slightly. She had expected something different, perhaps an explanation, a justification, but not this raw truth, this quiet admission. She knew that the bond between Azeru and the gardens was something deep, something primal, but she hadn't realized how profoundly it affected him, how it shaped his very being. She stepped closer, her heart heavy with an empathy she hadn't known she was capable of. You shouldn't have to be alone, she said, her voice soft but firm. Azeru's chest tightened at her words. There was something in her tone, in the way she said it, that made him feel something he had not allowed himself to feel in a long time. The sting of loneliness, sharp and bitter, like a wound reopened. He had never considered that being alone might be something other than a simple fact of his life. It had always been this way since he was young, since he first walked the gardens under the watchful eyes of the king's wives and the royal officials who came and went. He had always been alone in the silence, his only companions the plants and the soil, the night and the stars. But Laleh's words, simple as they were, cut through the layers he had built around himself. Azeru paused, his hand still resting on the vine he had been tending to. He looked at her, his gaze unreadable for a moment. "I am used to it," he said, his voice rough, as though the words were foreign on his tongue. It was the truth, but it felt incomplete, as if something were missing, something he could not put into words. "That doesn't make it right," Laleh said, her voice steady. The words hit him harder than he expected. They were not a rebuke, not an accusation, but an observation, a simple truth that made him realize just how much he had come to accept the solitude of his life as something unchangeable. But in that moment, looking at Laleh, with her earnest eyes and her unwavering gaze, something inside him stirred. Her words were true. He should not have to be alone, but how could he not be? The garden demanded his attention, its needs pulling him deeper into its secrets, its mysteries. The plants, the earth, the very fabric of the gardens, they were his responsibility, his burden to bear. It was a weight that no one else could understand, let alone share. And yet, here was Laleh, standing before him, offering something he had never dared to ask for. The weight of her presence in his life was a burden, yes, but it was also a strange comfort. In her, he felt the stirrings of something long forgotten, a connection, a spark of warmth in a world that had been defined by the cold, calculated rhythm of the earth and its cycles. She had become a part of the gardens in a way he hadn't expected, and though he feared what that might mean, he also knew, deep down, that he had allowed it to happen. He had chosen to teach her, to show her the language of the plants, to let her walk beside him in the silence of the night. "I can't promise that it will ever be easy," he said, his voice quieter now, filled with a strange vulnerability. "But I will teach you. I will show you everything I know." Laleh's eyes softened, and for the first time she reached out to touch his arm. A simple gesture, but one that spoke volumes. "I'll learn, Azeru. I'll learn everything." And in that moment, as the garden pulsed around them, as the vines whispered in their quiet, secret language, Azeru felt a shift, a subtle change, deep in the soil of his heart. The promise he had made to teach her, to show her the world of the gardens, was not just a promise to her, it was a promise to himself as well. A promise to finally allow someone else into his world, into his solitude, and to share the burden that he had carried alone for so long. As the days wore on, a tension began to build, unnoticed by most, but impossible for Azeru to ignore. It crept in like a shadow that lengthened as the sun sank lower, darkening the skies over the hanging gardens, and drawing the first stirrings of unease from the very soil itself. Azeru had lived in the silence of the gardens for so long that he had learned to understand its subtle rhythms, the way the plants responded to the winds, the water, the light. But now, something had changed. Every night, when he ventured into the gardens, the plants had begun to stiffen in a way they never had before. as if bracing themselves for something. The vines grew tighter, their tendrils curling inward. The flowers, once eager to bloom under the moon's gentle gaze, now seemed to close prematurely, as though reluctant to reveal their beauty. The air itself seemed heavier, thick with the weight of some unseen presence. The gardens were on edge, and Azeru could feel it in his bones. Laleh, too, noticed the change. Her once enthusiastic questions had given way to a quiet unease that hung between them as they worked. She, like Azeru, had felt the pull of something darker growing, something that neither of them fully understood. "Something's wrong," she said one evening, her voice laced with a quiet dread. She had just pruned the last of the lantern lilies, but her gaze was distant, her attention drawn elsewhere, as if she were listening to something that had become increasingly harder to ignore. Azeru turned toward her, his expression unreadable, though his heart raced beneath his chest. He knew exactly what she meant. It was the same feeling that had been gnawing at him for days. The weight of it, the tightening of the air around them, made it feel as though the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. He glanced out over the terraces, where the vines cascaded down the stone steps, their leaves trembling in the windless night. Beyond them, the royal palace rose in the distance, its towers dark against the starry sky. The sight of it made something inside him tighten, a warning he had learned to heed over the years. "The day world has begun watching the night world," Azeru said softly, his gaze fixed on the looming silhouette of the palace. "That is never good." Laleh looked at him, her brow furrowed in confusion. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Azeru turned to face her, his eyes sharp in the moonlight. "The palace," he said. "It has always watched the gardens. The king, the officials, they've always seen them as a luxury, a place to be admired. But now, they are looking closer. They're noticing things they shouldn't." Laleh felt a chill race down her spine. The thought of the palace turning its gaze toward the gardens, toward the strange power that seemed to pulse in the soil beneath their feet, filled her with a quiet, gnawing fear. She had never considered the gardens in that light. Their beauty, their wonder, had always seemed like something separate, something untouchable. But now, with the unease that seemed to settle into every corner of the place, she understood. The gardens were not just a treasure for the queen, nor a symbol of the king's power. They were something more, something that could be dangerous if misused, something that, if understood too deeply, could break the balance between the day world and the night world. "Do you think they know about—" Laleh hesitated, unable to complete the thought. Azeru's expression darkened, his gaze flickering toward the palace once again. "I don't know," he muttered, "but I feel it. There is a shift in the air, and the garden is reacting. It's more restless than I've ever felt it before." And the following days were heavy, with a palpable sense of foreboding. The usual tranquility of the gardens had vanished, replaced by a subtle but growing disturbance that neither of them could quite place. The star vines, once vibrant and full of life, now trembled even in the stillest air. The trees, too, seemed to lean inward, their branches curling protectively around the flowers and plants, as if trying to shield them from something unseen. The water channels, once steady and calm, now rushed too quickly, their flow erratic, as though the earth itself was uneasy with the changes above it. And then the rumors began. At first, it was just whispers, a servant who had heard something strange one night, another who had seen flickering lights in the distance, strange tremors that shook the ground as though something ancient had stirred beneath the earth. But as the days passed, the rumors grew, and with them the unease in the palace walls. The servants, once content in their duties, began to murmur in the halls, casting furtive glances toward the gardens, speaking in hushed tones of what they thought they had seen and heard. Voices echoing through the vines, lights that danced on the terraces when no one was there. It didn't take long for these whispers to reach the ears of those higher in the palace officials, scribes, and, eventually, the king himself. Azeru had no way of knowing this at the time, but he felt the change in the air. The gardens, once his sacred realm, were no longer just his. The world of the palace, the world of officials and power, had turned its gaze downward upon the green expanse of terraces and vines. And that gaze, Azeru knew, could never be a benign one. He had long since realized that the hanging gardens were not simply a place of beauty, but a place of power, a place that held ancient, untapped forces beneath the surface. And now, with the king's attention turning toward them, Azeru knew the balance that had kept the gardens kept him safe for so long was in danger. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden hue over the sprawling gardens, Azeru stood atop the highest terrace, looking out toward the palace. The light from the setting sun painted the palace towers in shades of gold and crimson, but the beauty of the scene did little to ease the weight in his chest. He could feel the watchful eyes of the king and his court, the shift in the balance that had once been so carefully maintained. Laleh stood beside him, her presence a quiet comfort. She had grown more attuned to the gardens, more aware of the subtle shifts in the air, and though she had not spoken of it, she, too, sensed the growing tension. "They are watching," Azeru said quietly, his voice low, almost a whisper. "The king's eyes have turned nightward." Laleh's brow furrowed. "What does that mean for us?" Azeru's gaze darkened, and he turned his eyes back toward the palace, his expression solemn. "It means they will come. It means they will demand what they think is theirs." Laleh's heart sank, and she felt a coldness creep into the air around them. It was not just the gardens they would take everything. The mystery, the power, the quiet that had lived between them and the earth for so long. The balance that had kept the gardens alive in the dark, hidden away from the prying eyes of men, was now under threat. And soon, the king would want answers. He would want more than just the beauty of the gardens. He would want the power that lay beneath the soil. Azeru looked at Laleh, his eyes sharp with determination. "We cannot allow them to take what they do not understand," he said, his voice low, filled with resolve. "The gardens must remain hidden, untouched, by those who seek to exploit them. We must protect them at all costs." Laleh nodded, her resolve firming within her. She had come to care for the gardens, had come to understand the delicate balance between night and day, between the living and the eternal. She would not let it fall into the hands of those who could not see it for what it truly was. But as the shadows lengthened and the stars began to emerge in the sky, the sense of impending danger only grew stronger. The king's eyes were watching, and soon they would come for the gardens, for everything Azeru had worked to protect. And Azeru knew, as he stood there beside Laleh, that the time for hiding was coming to an end. The world of light was pressing in on the world of night, and the balance would soon shatter. The sun dipped lower in the sky, its last rays casting long shadows over the hanging gardens. And yet Azeru felt none of the familiar peace that evening. It was as if the light itself carried with it an ominous weight, pressing down on the gardens, on him. He had known deep down that the time would come when the world of the palace would turn its attention fully upon the garden, but the reality of it felt far more suffocating than he had ever anticipated. It came as a messenger, fast, direct, and unmistakable in its urgency. The royal messenger found him just before the sun sank behind the distant dunes, his presence an unwelcome interruption to the quiet rhythm of Azeru's work. The messenger, resplendent in his embroidered tunic, dismounted and approached with an air of both deference and command. "Night Keeper," the man announced, his voice clipped, businesslike. "His Majesty orders you to present yourself at dawn. There are questions regarding disturbances in the gardens." Azeru's heart sank, his blood turning cold at the mere mention of the king. He had expected this day to come, but the weight of it was no less heavy. Disturbances in the gardens? What disturbances could they be referring to? He had worked quietly, methodically, for years, with nothing but the whispers of plants and the sound of water in his ears. Yet, now the world beyond the garden walls had noticed, and not with curiosity or wonder, but suspicion, fear. He held the messenger's gaze, his words calm but carrying a force that even he didn't fully understand. "Tell His Majesty I serve the garden first." The messenger's eyes widened, and for a brief moment there was a flicker of fear in them. "That is not the answer he wants," he said, his voice almost faltering. Azeru could see the strain on the messenger's face, the knowledge that his words would carry weight, that this was no simple errand. The king was not a man to tolerate disobedience, not a man to accept any deflection of his will. The messenger hesitated for a moment longer before turning, retreating into the shadows, his steps quick and nervous. Azeru stood there, still, watching him leave, his heart pounding in his chest. As the messenger's figure disappeared into the distance, a cold knot formed inside Azeru. It tightened, like the grip of something ancient and unyielding. He had known the king's curiosity would eventually become a threat, but now that it was here, now that the danger was upon him, he felt an unfamiliar sense of dread creeping into his bones. That night, the garden felt different. It was as if the plants themselves could sense the shift in the air, the change in the balance. The familiar hum of root speak seemed muted, distant, as though the earth itself were holding its breath. The vines, those once lively tendrils that he had tended to for so long, were stiff and unyielding. The lotus pond, usually serene, rippled uneasily under the starlight. Azeru walked the familiar paths with shaking hands, his mind consumed by thoughts of what was to come. He watered the vines with a trembling hand, each motion mechanical, automatic, but he could feel the weight of it all pressing on him. The garden was not the only thing in danger now. He was too. Laleh appeared beside him, her footsteps soft on the stone path. Her presence was always a quiet comfort, but tonight it felt heavier than usual, as if even she could sense the storm that was beginning to gather. "You must leave the city," Azeru insisted, his voice low and urgent. His eyes met hers, filled with a deep, unspoken fear. "They will question you too. You cannot stay here. You don't understand the danger." Laleh's eyes were unwavering, her gaze locked on his. She stood still for a moment, as if contemplating his words, but the look in her eyes told him she had already made up her mind. "I'm not leaving," she said simply, her voice firm, almost resolute. Azeru closed his eyes for a moment, exhaling sharply, frustration and fear building within him. He couldn't protect her if she refused to leave. The garden, the world of night that they had shared in silence, was now threatening to consume them both. He had never wanted anyone else involved in the quiet world of the garden, but Laleh, so curious, so eager to understand, had become an inextricable part of it. And now she was in danger too. "You don't understand," he whispered, his voice breaking under the weight of his fears. He opened his eyes, meeting her gaze. The king sees only what threatens order. If he believes the garden holds secrets beyond his control, Laleh's face softened, but there was no pity in her expression, only a grim understanding. He will destroy it, she finished for him, her voice a quiet echo of the truth neither of them wanted to face. Azeru's heart clenched. Yes, that was the fear. The king was not a man to accept anything that could challenge his rule. And the garden, this place of ancient power, was something that could not be controlled. It was something that existed beyond the king's grasp, beyond the kingdom itself, and the very existence of something that could not be bent to his will was an affront to a ruler like Nebuchadnezzar. The weight of it settled in the pit of his stomach, the realization of what was coming, what could happen if the king pressed his hand too far into the garden's secrets. It was not just the garden that was in danger, but everything it had protected. The balance between the earth, the plants, the night, and the people who had lived beside them, it was all fragile, and the king's gaze threatened to shatter it. "I have to protect the garden," Azeru whispered, his voice barely audible as he turned away from her, his heart heavy. "But I cannot do it alone. You must go, Laleh. I cannot ask you to stay." Laleh stepped closer to him, her voice steady and sure. "I'm not leaving," she repeated. She placed a hand on his arm, grounding him in the moment. "I'll stay with you. We'll face it together." Azeru didn't know whether to be relieved or afraid. Her words brought him comfort, but they also made the weight of the danger feel all the more real. He could not promise her safety, could not protect her from the king's wrath. He had never asked for anyone to stand with him in the garden, but Laleh had come into his life like a force of nature, and now there was no turning back. He felt the familiar pulse of the garden beneath his feet, the slow, steady rhythm of the roots deep in the earth. The garden had always been his sanctuary, and his burden. And now it was more than that. It was a symbol of resistance, a place that stood in defiance of the king's power. And he would fight for it, for all that it represented, for all that it had given him. He turned back to the lotus pond, the water rippling softly under the moonlight, and for a moment he let himself breathe. The garden had spoken to him for years, guiding him through the quiet nights, teaching him its language. But now, the world beyond the garden had turned its eyes toward him, and he knew that the time for silence was over. The king's command was inevitable, but so too was the fight for the garden's survival. With a final glance at Laleh, his resolve solidified. "We protect the garden," he said, his voice firm, his eyes burning with determination. "No matter the cost." And as the night deepened around them, the air heavy with the scent of flowers and damp earth, Azeru knew that the storm was coming. The king's eyes had turned nightward, and it was only a matter of time before they came for everything that Azeru had fought to protect. But as long as he stood in the garden, as long as the plants whispered their secrets, he would never surrender. As if sensing his fear, the gardens reacted with unprecedented intensity. The lotus pond rippled violently. Vines twisted and curled like waking serpents. The stone beneath Azeru's feet vibrated as the underground water engine surged. Laleh clutched his arm. "Azeru, it's angry." "No," he said. "It is scary." The well of Kishar erupted with a plume of shimmering mist that lit the terraces green. Leaves shuddered in waves like a single organism. Azeru knelt beside the well. "Please," he whispered. "Calm. Nothing must appear strange." The well answered with a pulse of warning. The sun dipped lower in the sky, its last rays casting long shadows over the hanging gardens, and yet Azeru felt none of the familiar peace that evening. It was as if the light itself carried with it an ominous weight, pressing down on the gardens, on him. He had known, deep down, that the time would come when the world of the palace would turn its attention fully upon the garden. But the reality of it felt far more suffocating than he had ever anticipated. It came as a messenger, fast, direct, and unmistakable in its urgency. The royal messenger found him just before the sun sank behind the distant dunes, his presence an unwelcome interruption to the quiet rhythm of Azeru's work. The messenger, resplendent in his embroidered tunic, dismounted and approached with an air of both deference and command. "Nightkeeper," the man announced, his voice clipped, businesslike. "His Majesty orders you to present yourself at dawn. There are questions regarding disturbances in the gardens." Azeru's heart sank, his blood turning cold at the mere mention of the king. He had expected this day to come, but the weight of it was no less heavy. Disturbances in the gardens? What disturbances could they be referring to? He had worked quietly, methodically, for years, with nothing but the whispers of plants and the sound of water in his ears. Yet now the world beyond the garden walls had noticed, and not with curiosity or wonder, but suspicion, fear. He held the messenger's gaze, his words calm but carrying a force that even he didn't fully understand. "Tell His Majesty I serve the garden first." The messenger's eyes widened, and for a brief moment there was a flicker of fear in them. "That is not the answer he wants," he said, his voice almost faltering. Azeru could see the strain on the messenger's face, the knowledge that his words would carry weight, that this was no simple errand. The king was not a man to tolerate disobedience, not a man to accept any deflection of his will. The messenger hesitated for a moment longer before turning, retreating into the shadows, his steps quick and nervous. Azeru stood there, still, watching him leave, his heart pounding in his chest. As the messenger's figure disappeared into the distance, a cold knot formed inside Azeru. It tightened, like the grip of something ancient and unyielding. He had known the king's curiosity would eventually become a threat, but now that it was here, now that the danger was upon him, he felt an unfamiliar sense of dread creeping into his bones. That night, the garden felt different. It was as if the plants themselves could sense the shift in the air, the change in the balance. The familiar hum of root-speak seemed muted, distant, as though the earth itself were holding its breath. The vines, those once lively tendrils that he had tended to for so long, were stiff and unyielding. The lotus pond, usually serene, rippled uneasily under the starlight. Azeru walked the familiar paths with shaking hands, his mind consumed by thoughts of what was to come. He watered the vines with a trembling hand, each motion mechanical, automatic, but he could feel the weight of it all pressing on him. The garden was not the only thing in danger now. He was too. Laleh appeared beside him, her footsteps soft on the stone path. Her presence was always a quiet comfort, but tonight it felt heavier than usual, as if even she could sense the storm that was beginning to gather. "You must leave the city," Azeru insisted, his voice low and urgent. His eyes met hers, filled with a deep, unspoken fear. "They will question you too. You cannot stay here. You don't understand the danger." Laleh's eyes were unwavering, her gaze locked on his. She stood still for a moment, as if contemplating his words, but the look in her eyes told him she had already made up her mind. "I'm not leaving," she said simply, her voice firm, almost resolute. Azeru closed his eyes for a moment, exhaling sharply, frustration and fear building within him. He couldn't protect her if she refused to leave. The garden, the world of night that they had shared in silence, was now threatening to consume them both. He had never wanted anyone else involved in the quiet world of the garden, but Laleh, so curious, so eager to understand, had become an inextricable part of it. And now, she was in danger too. "You don't understand," he whispered, his voice breaking under the weight of his fears. He opened his eyes, meeting her gaze. The king sees only what threatens order. If he believes the garden holds secrets beyond his control, Laleh's face softened. But there was no pity in her expression, only a grim understanding. "He will destroy it," she finished for him, her voice a quiet echo of the truth neither of them wanted to face. Azeru's heart clenched. Yes, that was the fear. The king was not a man to accept anything that could challenge his rule. And the garden, this place of ancient power, was something that could not be controlled. It was something that existed beyond the king's grasp, beyond the kingdom itself. And the very existence of something that could not be bent to his will was an affront to a ruler like Nebuchadnezzar. The weight of it settled in the pit of his stomach. The realization of what was coming, what could happen if the king pressed his hand too far into the garden's secrets. It was not just the garden that was in danger, but everything it had protected. The balance between the earth, the plants, the night, and the people who had lived beside them, it was all fragile, and the king's gaze threatened to shatter it. "I have to protect the garden," Azeru whispered, his voice barely audible as he turned away from her, his heart heavy. "But I cannot do it alone. You must go, Laleh. I cannot ask you to stay." Laleh stepped closer to him, her voice steady and sure. "I'm not leaving," she repeated. She placed a hand on his arm, grounding him in the moment. "I'll stay with you. We'll face it together." Azeru didn't know whether to be relieved or afraid. Her words brought him comfort, but they also made the weight of the danger feel all the more real. He could not promise her safety, could not protect her from the king's wrath. He had never asked for anyone to stand with him in the garden, but Laleh had come into his life like a force of nature, and now there was no turning back. He felt the familiar pulse of the garden beneath his feet, the slow, steady rhythm of the roots deep in the earth. The garden had always been his sanctuary and his burden. And now, it was more than that. It was a symbol of resistance, a place that stood in defiance of the king's power, and he would fight for it, for all that it represented, for all that it had given him. He turned back to the lotus pond, the water rippling softly under the moonlight, and for a moment, he let himself breathe. The garden had spoken to him for years, guiding him through the quiet nights, teaching him its language. But now, the world beyond the garden had turned its eyes toward him, and he knew that the time for silence was over. The king's command was inevitable, but so too was the fight for the garden's survival. With a final glance at Laleh, his resolve solidified. "We protect the garden," he said, his voice firm, his eyes burning with determination. "No matter the cost." End of 40. And as the night deepened around them, the air heavy with the scent of flowers and damp earth, Azeru knew that the storm was coming. The king's eyes had turned nightward, and it was only a matter of time before they came for everything that Azeru had fought to protect. But as long as he stood in the garden, as long as the plants whispered their secrets, he would never surrender. The first light of dawn broke over the horizon, casting a pale gold across the city, as Azeru stood alone in the grand hall of the palace. The silence in the chamber was suffocating, heavy with anticipation. The weight of the king's gaze felt like a physical pressure, bearing down on him, as though Nebuchadnezzar could peer directly into his soul. Azeru had tended to the gardens in solitude for years, the night his only companion, but now the world of daylight had come for him, and he was nothing more than a man facing judgment. Laleh was there, though she stood hidden among the scribes who filled the court, their eyes averted as they watched the proceedings with practiced indifference. Her presence, though invisible to most, was a quiet comfort to Azeru. He could feel her gaze, filled with concern, following every movement he made, but he did not dare to meet her eyes now. The moment was too fragile. Every word spoken in the king's court could mean the difference between life and death for them both. Nebuchadnezzar, seated on his throne of polished stone, watched him with cold, unwavering authority. The king's eyes gleamed with suspicion, his posture regal, his fingers drumming lightly against the armrests. He was a ruler used to command, and in the silence of that room, it was clear who held power. But even so, Azeru stood tall, his back straight, his breath steady, though inside his heart raced. He had known this moment would come. He had felt it in the tremor of the earth, in the restless murmurs of the vines, in the tightening of the soil beneath his feet. You tend the gardens alone every night. Nebuchadnezzar's voice broke through the stillness, icy and direct. Yet there are disturbances my guards cannot explain. Tell me why. End quote. Azeru bowed deeply, his mind racing as he gathered his thoughts, his words carefully chosen. The king's question was not a simple one. It was an accusation dressed as curiosity, a probing search for something Azeru was unwilling to reveal. Yet the truth was far more dangerous than any lie could ever be. The gardens are alive, Majesty, Azeru said, his voice steady but carrying a depth of meaning that he knew the king would not easily grasp. They move as the earth moves. You must not fear their voice. There was a brief silence, and then the king's eyes narrowed, his lips pressing into a tight line. His gaze turned to ice, and the weight of it seemed to crush the air around them. Nebuchadnezzar was not a man accustomed to being spoken to like this. His empire was built on power, on control, and on fear. To suggest that there was something beyond his reach, something alive and unknowable, was a direct challenge to his authority. Plants do not have a voice, the king said flatly, his voice a low growl, as if the very idea of such a thing was a mockery to his understanding of the world. Azeru swallowed, the words rising in his throat like a bitter taste. But he had already stepped too far into the unknown. There was no turning back now. Yours do, Azeru said, his voice firm, though the words felt like a stone lodged deep in his chest. He met the king's gaze steadily, unwilling to flinch, even as the murmur of disbelief swept through the court. A long silence followed, the tension so thick it could almost be cut with a knife. Laleh's breath caught in her throat, and though she tried to remain hidden, her heart raced in time with Azeru's. She knew the risk he was taking. She had seen the way the king's eyes burned with suspicion, and she could feel the tightening grip of danger around them both. Nebuchadnezzar leaned forward, his expression darkening as he looked at the night-keeper with growing contempt. His fingers tightened around the armrests, and his voice grew colder, more dangerous. If you are hiding anything, if you threaten the peace, I will raise the terraces stone by stone, the king threatened, his words laced with venom, a command backed by the full force of his power. I will burn it all to the ground if necessary. Azeru's chest tightened at the king's words. He knew that the gardens were not just a luxury or a symbol of the king's grandeur. They were something far older, far more powerful than Nebuchadnezzar could ever understand. If the king destroyed them, he would not only erase the beauty of the hanging gardens, he would destroy something that had existed long before any empire had ever risen, something that could never be rebuilt. The garden held the memory of the earth, the pulse of life that had been there since the beginning of time. Azeru had never spoken of the gardens in this way. not to anyone. And now, as the king's eyes bore down on him, he realized how much danger he had invited into their world. But it was too late for silence. The truth was out now, and there was no taking it back. If you destroy them, you destroy something older than your empire, Azeru replied, his voice unwavering. The court gasped collectively at his words, the shock rippling through the room like a wave. Some of the scribes exchanged worried glances, their eyes flicking nervously between the king and the night keeper. Even the guards, normally so stoic, shifted uncomfortably at the weight of Azeru's declaration. To speak of the gardens as something older than Babylon itself, something that could not be controlled, not even by the king, was to speak of a power that threatened the very foundation of the empire. Nebuchadnezzar's face hardened, his jaw tightening as he took in Azeru's words. His eyes blazed with fury. But there was something else there too, something deeper, a flicker of recognition, as if a part of him understood what Azeru was saying. Perhaps, deep down, he had always known that the gardens were more than just a marvel of human engineering, more than just a gift to his queen. Perhaps, somewhere in the recesses of his mind, he had feared the true power of the earth beneath his feet. But the king would never admit to such things. Instead, he leaned forward, his voice cold and final. "You will prove your innocence tonight," he said, his words like a sentence. "My guards will accompany you. You will show me what you claim to be the voice of the earth, or you will watch as the gardens are torn down, stone by stone." Azeru's blood went cold at the king's command. His first instinct was to refuse, to stand firm and protect the gardens with his life, but he knew the power of the king's wrath. Nebuchadnezzar would not be swayed. The guards would be with him, and there would be no room for hesitation, no time for debate. The king had spoken. Laleh's heart pounded in her chest, her breath catching in her throat. She had seen Azeru face many challenges, but this was different. The weight of the king's words was more than just a threat. It was a declaration of war against everything Azeru had fought to protect. The garden, the plants, the earth itself, they were on the verge of being destroyed, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Azeru met the king's gaze once more, his resolve hardening. He knew what was at stake. He knew what he had to do. The garden was his responsibility, and if it meant walking into the heart of danger, into the very hands of the king's power, then he would do so without flinching. The room was silent, the tension unbearable. "If you truly believe the gardens are a threat to your empire, Majesty," Azeru said quietly, his voice carrying a quiet strength, "then I will show you their heart. But be warned, what you find there will change everything you think you know." The king's gaze never wavered. "Then we shall see," Nebuchadnezzar replied, his voice final as he stood from his throne. As the court began to disperse, the heavy footsteps of the guards echoed in the chamber, their presence a constant reminder of the peril that lay ahead. Laleh's eyes met Azeru's one final time. Her expression filled with fear, but also something else, something that only the two of them shared, a quiet understanding. The moment had arrived. That night, 2 armed guards followed Azeru through the terraces, torches blazing. Their presence disrupted the delicate balance. The plants recoiled from the flames. Rootbeak trembled with distress. Laleh hid herself among the columns, terrified. Azeru whispered urgently to the gardens, "Be still, please." But the well of Kishar pulsed uncontrollably. A thin mist crawled along the pathways like luminous fog. The guards raised their torches, frightened. "What sorcery is this?" one shouted. "It is breath," Azeru pleaded. "Do not fear it." But fear already bloomed too wide. The guards advanced toward the well, blades drawn. "Stay back," Azeru cried. They ignored him. When one guard thrust his torch toward the well, the entire terrace erupted in violent reaction. Vines lashed out like living whips. The stone trembled. Trees bent unnaturally. The guard screamed and dropped his torch. Azeru threw himself between them and the vines. "No, stop. They only defend." But the garden was past reason. Laleh ran toward him. "Azeru," he grabbed her hand. "We must calm it. Together." "How?" "Speak. Not with words. With intent." The well pulsed, waiting. Azeru and Laleh knelt and pressed their palms against the warm stone. They breathed in unison. The garden listened. Slowly, the tremors eased. The vines loosened. The mist thinned. But the damage was done. The guards fled straight to the king. By dawn, Azeru was seized. Laleh, too. King Nebuchadnezzar stood above them, furious. "You consort with forces you cannot control," he said. "You endanger my palace." Azeru lowered his head. "Majesty, the garden lives. It only defends itself." "That is exactly the problem," the king replied coldly. "I cannot rule a kingdom that fears its own trees." He raised a hand. "The terraces will be purged. The water engine dismantled." Laleh gasped. Azeru felt his heart snap like a thin root torn from soil. "Majesty," Azeru whispered, "if you unmake the garden, you unmake a miracle." Nebuchadnezzar turned away. Miracles serve kings, not the other way around. That night would be Azeru's final one in the gardens. Guards stood watch along every terrace. Workers prepared tools to dismantle the water systems by dawn. Azeru wandered through the leaves with despair thick in his chest. Laleh walked beside him, silent. The plants drooped, sensing their fate. Azeru stopped before the well of Kishar. "It doesn't deserve this," he whispered. "None of you do." Laleh touched his shoulder. "Then don't let it happen." He looked at her. "I am only one man, but the garden listens to you." Azeru turned toward the well. "And what if I ask for something impossible?" "Then it will try," she said. Azeru knelt before the well. The mist rose instantly, swirling around him in reverent spirals. Laleh placed her hand on his. Together they spoke not with tongues, but with breath and heartbeat, with the silent language of longing. The garden answered. The terraces trembled. The vines glowed. The water engine roared to life with unnatural strength. A luminous wave surged from the well, expanding across terraces, climbing columns, washing over every leaf and branch. The garden awakened fully, completely. Azeru felt his body dissolve into the pulse of root speak. For one impossible moment, he felt the entire garden's consciousness move through him. He whispered, "Live." The garden obeyed. At dawn, when the king and his guards approached, expecting a crumbling structure, they witnessed something unthinkable. The hanging gardens were gone. Not destroyed. Gone. The terraces remained, bare and cracked. But every tree, vine, flower, and root had vanished. A faint trail of glowing mist drifted outward toward the horizon, as if the garden had uprooted itself and walked away. Laleh clutched Azeru's arm, speechless. Nebuchadnezzar stared in disbelief. Where is my garden?" Azeru met his gaze. "It was never yours." The king trembled with rage and fear, but he could not punish Azeru for something he could not comprehend. By nightfall, Azeru and Laleh were banished, exiled to wander the deserts, but they left with no regret. Weeks later, under a vast purple sky, Azeru and Laleh wandered into a remote valley near ancient hills. They heard a familiar sound, soft water, running where no river flowed. As they approached, moonlight revealed impossible shapes, a star vine dangling from a cliff, a lotus blooming in dry sand, a fig tree glowing softly in the windless night. Azeru fell to his knees. The garden had returned to them fragment by fragment, root by root, reassembling itself as a sanctuary, far from kings and torches. Laleh whispered, "It followed you." Azeru answered softly, "No, it followed who we became." He stepped into the moonlit grove, his shadow thin as ever, his burden finally lifted. The midnight garden of Babylon breathed around them, alive and free. And so the wonder of the world survived, not as a monument, but as a living secret held between two wanderers and the earth itself. Thank you for walking through this midnight tale, for listening to the whisper of roots and the song of moonlit water. If this story drew you in, if you felt the glow of the starvines or the pulse of the ancient well, then I invite you to help the story grow. Like the video if the journey moved you. Comment to share what part resonated most. Subscribe so you won't miss the next tale waiting just beyond the horizon. More stories bloom in the dark, and I will be here to guide you through them.